Wonderful. Thank you, Eric. Thank you so much. And good afternoon, everybody. Julie and I are really excited to be on today to share with you our approach and experience in launching brands in the US market. We do have a lot to cover. So as Eric mentioned, we're going to actually move right through our slides. And then if you would just capture any questions in the Q&A, we will do our best to answer them at the end. We're going to leave about 10 to 15 minutes at the end to do that. But we'll also do our best to follow up afterwards to address any questions if we're not able to in our 45 minutes, because I know you have another session to move on to. So as Eric mentioned, Julie and I founded our company about 20 years ago after spending 15 years at P&G, which is where we really established our understanding of brand marketing in the US within P&G. And then since then have really focused our efforts with Provisor against small and mid-sized brands in the US. And we have worked with brands that are in market, maybe a heritage brand that needs to grow. We have helped to launch brands in the US market. And very specifically, we have worked with international brands, bringing them into the US market. And Julie, if you'll flip to the next slide, since you're driving today. One very recent example that I wanted to share with you and that Julie and I will reference through our discussion today is very recent work that we did with a brand that came from New Zealand and wanted to launch in the US market. We started this work just over a year ago. That was they actually had 3 brands across 7+ SKUs that they were bringing into the US market. And our job was to help them develop their business model and launch into the US. And so we did work around consumer research, market research. We helped them actually develop a whole new brand because in the US, it was much more efficient for them to have one brand versus separate brands to launch under, and then develop all of their positioning. We worked on an entire new package design, creative package design for all of the SKUs, price and value plan, their retail go-to-market strategy, and their marketing plan. So we helped them really develop their entire business model. We were able to do that in about 7 months. We were ready to present to retailers in November. And I can't tell you what it is yet because it hasn't launched in market, but a major US retailer is going to be launching this brand in the market in May. So once that launches, we'll be able to share it. But it will provide us with a really good example of the work that we do and what we think is so important to be successful in the US market. And where we start, and this is our US brand strategy, this is our core philosophy and what we think is so important for all brands in the US market to be successful, but particularly for brands coming in from international markets. And that is first and foremost at the center of our business model is understanding the US consumer. And Julie's going to walk you through in a minute some insights on the US consumer. But from our experience, understanding your product and your category and how the US consumer consumes your product or the category and really understanding who they are and what their habits and practices are is absolutely essential, because then what you do is you build your business model around that understanding addressed to the target consumer. So your product choices, your positioning, how you market, all of the elements of your business model should address that target consumer and all be interconnected. And what we're going to do today is actually walk you through how we think about the target consumer and then really examples of each one of those business model elements, how important it is, some key questions that you should ask yourself relative to where your brand proposition is to the target consumer in the US. And we'll give you some specific examples as well of work we've done to help an international brand come into the US market relative to each of those business model elements. Julie, do you want to walk through the US consumer information?
Sure. Hello, everybody. Thanks for attending. I thought it was appropriate for us to make sure we were all kind of on the same page in terms of the US consumer in general. There are 328 million people in the United States. And they're what we call a true melting pot, meaning that there are many different types of people in the US that have different needs and backgrounds, et cetera. There are actually a declining group of people who actually identify themselves as white. and an increasing percentage of the population who identify as a different ethnicity, whether that's Hispanic or Asian, a different race like African American or multicultural. And so as a result, we will expect to continue to see that trend accelerating over the next 10 or 15 years, which then makes this market just a little bit more challenging because everybody is kind of coming from a different background. I think the key point here is that you can't reach or expect to reach all 328 million people in the same way or with the same business model, because everybody is just slightly different or very different depending on who you're talking to. So what we did in preparation for today's discussion is do a little bit of consumer research with a tool that we use in our business called Quick Assess. First question we asked was really around the pandemic and the behaviors that people are expecting to use from a buying perspective once the pandemic is over. We asked 200 consumers, through the pandemic, you've had to maybe buy brands that you wouldn't have normally bought because your favorite brand wasn't available. And so when these restrictions from this pandemic ease up, do you expect that you're going to go back to your old favorite brand? Or do you think that you will continue to look for new and different brands? Or maybe you've even found a new brand that you like even better. Here's what we saw, and it's frankly great news for all of us on this call. 62% of all respondents, now this is the US market, will keep trying new brands. And I think what's really interesting is that men felt that way even to a higher percentage than women. Older consumers, and by that we mean consumers who are ages 35 and above, and Hispanic consumers, all of those folks said, oh yeah, we are going to keep trying new brands. So I think the question you need to ask yourselves is how can my brand be ready when those US consumers who are looking for new brands are ready to come and find you? We also asked consumers, okay, how do you feel about international brands? Again, 200 consumers. Are you open to trying new brands that are from other countries? Whether that's a healthcare product, a skincare product, a food or beverage product, are you interested in a product that comes from another country? And again, great news, 88% of people said that they were interested in buying in some category, multiple categories, international brands. What I think is really interesting is that close to 1 out of 3 of these respondents said they love to try brands from other countries. They almost see it as a treasure hunt, meaning, oh, I really am excited to find something new and different that I didn't expect I would find. That's especially true for what we call Gen X and millennial consumers. Think about those as the folks who are 25 to 54 years of age. They especially love to try products from other countries. So then we asked them, okay, what's important to you when you're thinking about buying a brand from another country? And of course, overwhelmingly, they all said quality. The quality of the product has to be good and as good or better than what I find here in the United States. But the second thing that they were intrigued by or that they felt was important were product attributes that were specific to the country. So that whether that was a unique capability that the country is known for, unique flavors or ingredients or scents, all of those were things that they really felt were interesting to them when they're looking for new products. So think about that as what's unique about your brand or your product or your country that may be of interest to the US consumer. So when we think about what we call the target consumer, you may or may not use that wording within your company, but we think of that as the person who you are most interested in having buy your product in the United States. And so here are some of the questions we think you ought to be asking yourself before you bring your product to the US. What is the US consumer's job to be done in the category in which your product rests? And when we say job to be done, we mean, what does the consumer expect that this brand will do for them when they buy it? Second question, what is your unique point of difference in the US? We talked, on the last slide about unique ingredients and maybe story about the brand from the country that you're in. But that point of difference, how is it different from everything else they can buy in the US market is really important to understand. And that kind of leads into why should they even care? Why should they care about the product that you're bringing to market? And, you know, we always talk about the whole emotional aspect of it. Kate will address that when we talk about brand positioning. But people are more likely to buy something they really care about. And so that's something to think about. And then finally, the question to ask is how do they buy and use the products in the category? When do they use it? What do they use it for? What do they expect it to do? All of those habits and practices of your target consumer are important to understand. Kay mentioned that we did a U.S. brand launch business model for the company in New Zealand, and the challenge with that company was that they were bringing products to market that addressed a number of different jobs to be done that were slightly different. So one may have been a product for, a skin condition, another might have been a product for anti-aging, reducing wrinkles. But we needed to really understand the target consumer for each of those and what some of their common habits and practices were, since we wanted to create one brand for all of the different products within there. So we had a lot of research we had to do to really understand the consumer to a deeper degree because they had several different products they were bringing to market. So Kate, I'm going to turn this over to you now to talk about brand positioning and some of the other aspects of the business model.
Absolutely. So, as Julie said, we have lots of different tools that we use to understand the target consumer. But when we ask these questions about how they use the product, where they use the product, that informs us to be able to develop our brand positioning. And when it's really the foundational sort of description and way we talk about the brand that you're bringing into market. And there are several components. There's the brand name, there's a tagline. We often say the story, it's a short story, but 2 to 3 sentences that describe to the US consumer what is this brand about and why. As Julie said, I love the phrase, why should they care? What's going to get their interest in this brand and why is it important to them? So it's really important to start with is to at least draft that. What would the brand name be? What would your tagline and story be? How is this meaningful to the US consumer? And I'll share an example in a minute about how you really want to make sure that how you speak to your brand and your category in your country will translate well to the US market. So incredibly important. Another component that's very important to US consumers, and this is across all consumer groups, although it will vary based on the group, is an emotional connection. What we find for brands in the US is if you can connect not just to their immediate need of the brand, but kind of what their life expectation is and how you can kind of elevate your brand to an emotional is really important. So that's an important component to include in the brand positioning. We also, as Julie said, so important to be distinctive and different than the competition. So your brand positioning should also highlight that. What is different about your product that consumers would care about? And you also want to stand out in the marketplace. So your brand positioning, you want to understand what your competition, what they say about themselves and how they speak to consumers so that you can make sure you'll stand out in the marketplace. One example that we use, this is actually the reverse. This is where Coca-Cola took their brand outside of the US. Now, of course, in the US, Coca-Cola is a huge brand, but in order to take it out of the US and into, this was for the Middle East, they actually renamed it. So from Coca-Cola to Meca-Cola, which better fit the market. And their tagline is don't drink stupid, drink committed. Would not work in the US market, right? That's not. Here it's Coke and a Smile, which is the old one that they've done for years, because in the US market, they like to bring in that emotional connection. They had to reconfigure their positioning and their tagline for the market to make it work. What we've said once again is the American positioning doesn't always work outside of the country. And what we know is that outside of the country coming in, Julie and I were working on a project just last week where just the language they used to describe a skincare product wasn't correct. It wasn't addressing the need the way that consumer talks about it in the US, but it's how they would talk about it in their own country. So you have to be very aware. And that's once again where that consumer learning and research helps to inform how do they talk about your product and what would they expect. So on brand positioning, when we talk about what questions should you be asking is what's your story? What's going to resonate in the US? So we really do often do an exercise where we just write it out. We ask everyone to write out in just a few sentences. What's your brand? What's your reason to be here in the US? And then from there, you can often develop your brand name, your taglines, et cetera. But you sort of start with that story. And how do you incorporate your point of difference? Because it's so important that right away, very quickly, you're able to establish what point of meaning you have or what point of difference you have with the consumer. Incorporating, as I said, the way people talk about the category, using the right language and references for the category is so important. So with the positioning of the New Zealand brand, as Julie mentioned, we had to really think across all of the SKUs, but find that common understanding of consumers, because this was really an ingredient product where the core ingredient was different. How do we speak about that that will resonate with the core consumers? So important to do. And then lastly, so important on brand positioning, and I think this is global, but certainly in the US, is to double check that you can, with the US trademark office, that you can actually trademark your brand and or your tagline so that you make sure that it's what we call ownable. It's something that you can actually have and that it's not already in use. Very important that you want to double check that when you're developing your brand positioning. The next area is product assortment. Very important. And when we talk product assortment, we're talking different sizes, different forms, different varieties. What's so important, once again, is to understand, based on the category that you're in and the consumer expectations, for example, what's the right size? What we see with many international companies is based on their markets. They have smaller sizes, perhaps single use, or it might be enough that would last 2 weeks or so, but it's smaller because their marketplace supports smaller retail sales, dollar sales, as well as things that you can buy in markets where you have several different outlets. In the US, we have club stores. That's a huge size. That's something that someone would buy and keep on their shelf for months at a time. So really understanding your category. We used an example here for the US fabric care of not only what forms are sold, but also within laundry, you can think about what sizes might vary. Product form is important. Laundry pods were big in Asia before they were big here. It took a while for the consumers to adopt it. So what are consumers using today? If you have a form that's different and new, important to understand that changing consumer habits can take time. So how do consumers think and understand about the form that you present? And varieties can be very important. Flavors, ingredients, all of those things should be considered when you think about which products you want to bring to market and are going to be relevant for the market. On the project we were just working on, they brought to us 7 different SKUs. But as we got into evaluating the market, we realized there was one area that they weren't addressing. They actually had the product form that would be appropriate for the US market, but this usage occasion in the US is unique to the US. And so they were able to very quickly take a product that they already had, reposition it so that it was, and reconfigure it so that it was appropriate for the US market. And it was accepted and will be on the market with the original launch. So just an example of things to think about. When you're thinking about product assortment, do your sizes and forms that you have meet the needs of the US consumer? Are the flavor profiles a fit? You can do all kinds of trend analysis around what's trending in the US. Usually our restaurant, for flavors, usually our restaurant business leads what we find in our consumer goods business. So really understanding what fits and what's going to be the future in the US. And then which product applications will sell best in the category. All great questions to ask and consider as you're developing your brand business model. Product packaging. This is an area that's so important in the US. We know that with COVID, so much business, and I know in the next segment, you'll be talking more about retail, but we know people have moved to e-commerce. But at the same time, we also know that still 70% of the business is done in a retail store. And we believe, based on our research, that consumers are going to go back to shopping at retail. So your package design in the US, if it sits on a retail shelf, or if it's the picture of the product on Amazon, is incredibly important. It's the picture represents 1,000 words. So having the right product packaging is so important. On the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see an example of a partner that we have that does graphic design. And they were working with a company that was coming into the US from Israel, and they had a core brand package, but they wanted to adjust it for the US market so it would better suit the market. And you can see below, these are the changes that were made to the packaging. The brand name was changed, and that became the core most important word, was the overall brand name. You can see the graphics changed to be more relevant to the US market and to stand out on the market. The graphic from Israel, that looks a lot like a current brand that we have in the market today called Aveeno. It would not have stood out on the shelf, but this brand really stood out. They also created, the product on the left is actually it's a combination package, which allows consumers to buy several products at once because it's more of a system. And that was learning that they got from the consumer that said, I like to buy products in a set so I can have several different products to use to treat, and this was a hair care product. So important that you consider your package design and that you make sure that it resonates with the consumer, helps you stand out on shelf and online. And then finally, when it comes to product packaging, very important for consumers in the US is sustainability. So thinking about your package, do you need an inner and an outer package? It will depend on who your target consumer is. Certain consumers are more concerned with packaging and will make buying decisions based on sustainability, some not so much. So you really want to be able to be aware of your target consumer, but that's something certainly to be considering as you come into the US market. So questions to ask when it comes to product packaging in your business model. Does your packaging reflect the brand's positioning? Remember, we start there. What is so unique and important about your brand that's going to help you connect to your target consumer? Then make sure your package reflects that. Does it stand out at the point of commerce? Does it meet, oh, and very importantly, does it meet all US labeling requirements? That is something we talked about, trademark with naming. You also want to make sure when it comes to labeling that you're very aware, obviously, of any and all regulations based on the category that you're marketing in. And then is it ownable? Is it something that you can do that's unique? What we've learned in the US market is you can actually trademark colors and you can trademark symbols that help represent your brand. The example that we have here of Ollie was a brand that really was a game changer in the vitamins and supplements category when they came in with such a unique package design. So many things about it, but particularly their packages are very unique. They stand out on the shelf in a sea of products and different, all of the different vitamins that are on the shelf. This really, really stood out. So it was a good example of a brand that kind of went all in with a different approach to the category, but also with different packaging. Next, Julie, I think back to you for the commerce.
All right. We wanted to just touch on commerce quickly because I know that you're going to have Bruce and Tracy sharing much more about our retail environment here in the US. But I think for us, from a brand perspective, understanding where your consumer shops for your product and how they shop for your product is important. Kate mentioned the whole online, so e-commerce versus brick and mortar. Here in the US, and this is probably true for certain countries and not others, we've been slower than many countries in terms of the e-commerce transition from brick and mortar to e-commerce, especially for consumable type of products. Of course, the pandemic accelerated that. But we are, as Kate mentioned, seeing some information that says consumers are kind of excited to get back into the physical store. But I think what's important is that you really need to understand with your category and your type of product, where the consumer expects to buy it, where they're going to get information about it, and how that works together. So on this slide, you actually see, okay, do people shop in a physical store versus online? What do they like about online versus physical store? And you'll see here that based on age group, Generation Z being young, baby boomers being older, their reasons for shopping online versus in a physical store vary. So really understanding that dynamic is going to be important when you think about bringing your product to the US market. Here are some of the questions you want to ask yourself about commerce. And when we say commerce, we mean everywhere that a buyer can pay money for your product, whether that's e-commerce, social commerce via things like Facebook and Instagram, Pinterest, or brick and mortar, physical stores. So doing that research up front to really understand where they expect to find your product, what types of outlets. I mean, here in the US, we have a lot of different types of retail outlets, everything from the big club stores, as Kate mentioned, like Sam's and Costco, to beauty specialty stores like Ulta and Sephora, and kind of everything in between. We've got big retailers and smaller retailers. So based on the consumer and the product, where do they expect to find your product across the landscape, the retail landscape here in the US? And also importantly, where do they expect to find it in store? So for instance, if you had a vitamin, let's say, that treated eye health, well, the consumer may think to shop for it in the eye care category of a store, or they may think to shop for it in the vitamin section in the store. Now, in many cases, those are two different aisles within the physical store. And so understanding that is important to make sure that you are where you need to be when the consumer is looking for that product solution. And then finally, and really importantly from a commerce standpoint, is what we call the price value equation. So think about that as, what does the consumer expect to pay for the benefits that your product is offering them? And just because a product may be a premium or ultra premium product in your country doesn't necessarily mean that that will translate here to the US market. So really understanding how the consumer thinks about that will be very important when you think about setting your retail price here in the market. Now, for us, with the example that we had of the New Zealand company, because we had different product usage occasions and they satisfied different consumer needs, the consumer expected to find them in different types of retail outlets. So for a couple of the products, we started in beauty superstore. Another couple of products we started in mass merchants. So depending on how the consumer shops is how you think about your commerce strategy. And I'm sure that Bruce and Tracy will add to that in their section. Let's also talk about marketing strategy. This is one of those where, again, it can vary depending on the consumer and the product category. This chart here is a good example of the challenge faced by all marketers, worldwide, I think. And in this example, it's social media users. Depending on the gender, the ethnicity, the country, usage of social media varies. Tools vary. How often they're on varies. So understanding that marketing dynamic and how people find out about products and services is important, obviously in any country, but also here in the United States. And I think more importantly, it's crucial to make sure that your brand message appears in the same way, the brand positioning, the brand colors and patterns across all of the marketing vehicles that you choose for your target consumer to introduce your brand. This is actually information that we had gotten from the consumer on another project we worked on that was a food product. And what you see here, it's so interesting because the tools, the marketing tools and tactics that you use will vary not only by age group that you're focused on, but also by gender and by ethnicity. So you'll see on the right, tasting and sampling are that much more important for the people who are 36 years old and older. Then they're still important for the younger, but they're especially important for the older generation. Same with females. They tend to be like the tasting and the touching and that sort of thing. So understanding those dynamics are important. And when you're thinking about generating trial, getting somebody to try something for the first time, it's important to understand what's meaningful to the consumer when they're thinking about trying something new. How do they find out about new ideas? On the left on this grid, what this says is, okay, for the consumers for this food brand, recommendations by family and friends, tastings, and price all were equally important. Most of the time as marketers, we think, oh, well, price is probably the most important thing. But no, in this case, they're willing to pay a little bit more for a product that their friends and family recommend to them. Again, it gets back to that whole price value equation. So I think the moral of the story is there are a lot of ways to influence trial and repurchase here in the US, and it's important to understand those choices based on who you're trying to reach. For us with the New Zealand product, our challenge was that, of course, because we've got different product usage occasions, there were different influencers to purchase. So for the products where people, had a skin condition, a dermatologist, a skin doctor, a general practitioner, those were the medical professionals that were influencers. Whereas, the more beauty, wrinkle reducing, anti-aging type of product, you'd get estheticians or dermatologists. Or beauty magazines, beauty influencers on YouTube and TikTok. So those are the sorts of dynamics that are important to understand when you're thinking about marketing your product in the US. Here are some of the questions to ask yourself about that. What is your brand's marketing budget? I mean, probably like, other countries, we've got some really big consumer products manufacturers here. We work for one, Procter and Gamble. They have millions of dollars to spend on their marketing budgets. You may not have millions of dollars to spend on your budget. You may have $200,000. And so making sure that that $200,000 works as hard for you as possible is important. You need to understand who influences your target consumer's purchase decisions in your specific category. Just because, as I said earlier, a skin doctor may influence a purchase for a certain type of skincare product doesn't mean they necessarily are the biggest influencer for anti-aging products. Understanding the consumer's media habits, what are they? Do they listen to radio? Do they watch broadcast television? Do they watch YouTube? All of those different media habits are important to understand when you're thinking about crafting your marketing strategy. And then finally, and again, I'm sure Bruce and Tracy will address this in their discussion, but trade promotion. How do retailers, whether it's online or brick and mortar physical stores, how do they promote products in their retail outlet? And do they run price promotions? Do they have sampling efforts? What are all of those things that you should consider for your brand and your target consumer? All right, I'm now going to turn it over to Kate to talk about kind of the do's and don'ts that we see for a US brand launch.
Absolutely. And we are going a little over our 30-minute time, so I'll move fairly quickly. So we do have a few questions that I know we're going to want to answer at the end. But as we think about do's and don'ts of thinking about launching successfully in the US market is absolutely to do the research in advance, to identify your target consumer and their needs in your specific categories. And I know one of the questions that's come up that I can address now is that there are many different sources for getting research done in the US. We certainly are happy to share and do the work. We do a lot of consumer research, but this is what we think is the most foundational, is to really, really get in and understand the consumer, the consumer within the US market. So doing that research in advance, and what we call giving the US consumer a seat at the table. So once you do your initial research and you begin to develop your brand business model, go back to those consumers and ask them again. There are many ways to do this in online focus groups with different tools that you can validate with the US consumer who's your target if they find this appealing. So that's something that we really encourage you to do, is not only do the initial research to understand consumers, but then continue to have them involved as you build your brand. So you make sure you continue to develop your business model in a way that's going to be successful with the consumers who are going to buy it. And as always, we want to make sure that you consider US trademark and regulatory requirements, any legal requirements when it comes to your brand name. It is challenging in the US. So many brand names are taken, and you often want your brand name to be able to be your website URL. Do those match? So just important to keep that in mind. What we don't want you to do is presume that demand for your brand in the US is going to be the same as other countries. Consumers are just different. Our habits, our practices are so different. It's really important to make sure you kind of leave all those assumptions at the door when you come into the US, and really open yourself to understanding that there may be a very different reception of your category and or brand in the US. The other really important component is assuming that all US consumers are the same, because they're not. We had a client once who said, well, I'm a skincare product. I'm good for everybody who has skin. Not correct. First of all, it's very expensive to try to reach all 328 million. Very few brands do it. I think Coke spends about $800 million a year in advertising alone. That's a huge, broad brand. But for most brands, you can hone in and find that correct target consumer and then invest your dollars in reaching that consumer and understanding them. So making sure you really segment the population and understand who and where. You can get differences regionally in the US, West Coast, different than East Coast, urban versus suburban. So make sure you really understand the diversity of the US market. And please don't assume it's easy money. I know that, for us, we see a lot of folks come and say, oh, it's such a great big market. If I can just get in. It's expensive to do business, but if you do it right, you can be very successful. You just want to be very choiceful as you think about your retail approach, your marketing, et cetera, that you really understand ahead of time and you business model and plan for what you're going to do to be successful and launch in the marketplace. So things to include. Now, I know in the next section, you're going to hear more about this, but this is from our perspective. When we've done the work of doing consumer research and we've done our business modeling and our design work, these are the things we want to share with the retailers when we go in for our retailer meetings. And that is to share your consumer insight. If you've done research on the consumer, our retailers are pretty savvy about understanding consumer dynamics. It's important that you share your research and the basis for your choices in your brand development. Any US category trends that you're watching, that you're aware of, you want to make sure that you're sharing that as well. Your product background, your reason to believe, what's unique about your product, very important to share with retailers. Making sure you have a tailored brand business model for each retailer. So some brands will come and think about, how about I just partner exclusively with a retailer or with a channel? You want to think about that, and you want to really tailor your brand business model based on what you've learned about consumers engaging in your category and with your brand. One thing we found really helpful as well are specific product mock-ups, so that once you've redesigned your brand, you have it ready for the US market, you can bring live products that show your intention. It doesn't have to be a finished product, but at least a mock-up of what you plan to introduce to the US that shows you're ready to come to the US. Very important to bring with you and share with retailers. And then also just brand revenue projections, helping your retailers or your retail channels think about what kind of revenue can they expect from your brand. So these are things that we always make sure that we incorporate into a presentation once we've developed the business model and we're ready to meet with the retailers. How do we get started? I know this has been a lot of information that we've shared with you really quickly. There is a lot of work to do to get brands ready to come in the US, but getting started really isn't all that hard. So what we usually do is we start with, as Julie mentioned, we have a quick assess consumer research tool, and we're happy to share more information on this later, but it's a way that we can access US consumers and get really quick, as in within hours and days, response to core concepts. We do a competitive overview, looking in the marketplace, online research, market condition analysis, understanding what's going on in the dynamics of the market within the category and consumer usage. And then also business model assessment is really evaluating and creating each element, even if it's what we call an alpha business model. It's just a start. It's a drafted business model, but thinking about how all of your elements will work together That's generally the work that we do to get started so that at least we have a foundational business model that we can then begin to build from. So Q&A, we've had a few questions come in, and let me see if I can go back and grab some of these. I know one of the questions, if I'm going back to the fun, was assisting with consumer analysis and segmentation. That is work that we do. We are happy to talk offline. We will be sharing our presentation and our contact information. So we do a lot of work. We absolutely can assist and doing project work to help with identifying and doing consumer research. We have several different companies that we work with based on budget, time expectations, and what you need to learn. So we can definitely help with that. And doing consumer analysis and segmentation, that is work that we do always, because we know how important that is. Is the marketing strategy slide referencing only CPG or buying patterns in general? The marketing strategy actually would be relevant to really any category, product, or service for consumers. So as Julie's going back, this particular example that we showed was for a food product, and it definitely varies. So for example, a laundry product, tasting wouldn't be very important. It would be something different. So this really would vary based on the category, but it can be done for any category. So hopefully I'm answering that well. You could do this for any category, but this specifically was for a food product.
Well, and I was going to say, so the example we've been using, the New Zealand company, number one in terms of trial vehicles were influencers. And so, while here it was recommendation by family and friends for those skincare products, it was, influencers, and specifically healthcare influencers. So as Kate said, that's just an example. That's why it's so important to ask the question.
Okay, I think I have 1 minute, and I had one more question I'll answer really quickly, which was, how can we give the US consumer a seat at the table? Great question. There are so many cool new tools now that are available to connect you with consumers given the internet in the US. So we have a tool, I think we talked about it before, it was our quick assess, where we can go identify consumers who are interested in a category, and we're able to actually go back to those consumers. So there's over 1 million consumers on the platform. So we can identify consumers who are interested in a category. We can go back to them a month later, 6 months later, a year later, and say, we'd asked you about these initial questions, maybe now we would like to ask you further, maybe about an endorsement strategy, or we want you to look at our packaging and tell you what you think. So there definitely are ways that you can use the tools and the systems that are available here to give them a seat at the table. And so glad that you want to do that.
Well, and I was going to say, one of the other things that we've used really effectively that one of our research suppliers uses is an online focus group type of product that uses natural language processing. And we use it a lot for package design. When we say give the consumer a seat at the table, we mean each one of those business model elements, check your logic with the consumer. You can do it quickly through tools like Quick Assess, but this natural language processing is great because it lets them online talk about and vote on different package design elements and what they like about it, what they don't, and most importantly, you see how they talk about it. So you see the words that they're using, which then helps you maybe tweak your brand positioning a little bit. So there's a lot with technology now, and artificial intelligence in particular, a lot of research tools that are at our disposal that allow us to give that consumer a seat at the table.